Out in the heart of Wyoming, where the wind scours the paint off barns and the ground is so hard it remembers every sin, there stood a horse that was more monster than animal. He was a Shire stallion, big as a shed, black as a nightmare, 19 hands high and well over 2,000 pounds of pure, distilled violence. They kept him in a special pen, one made of reinforced steel. The kind of pen they'd use for a grizzly bear, maybe, and even that wasn't enough. He'd come to the Cheyenne auction yard with a reputation that walked ahead of him, a shadow of broken bones, shattered gates, and the ghosts of men who thought they could tame him. He was passed from ranch to ranch, not like property, but like a curse, each owner lasting a little less time than the one before. His name on the auction block was Lot 14, but the ranchers, the men with dust in their lungs and fear in their eyes, they had another name for him. They called him the Devil, and as the auctioneer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker, trying and failing to get a single bid, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This horse's next stop was a one-way trip to the slaughterhouse. The crowd was silent, a mix of fear and a strange kind of pity. No one wanted him, but no one wanted to watch him die either. Then from the edge of the shade, a man stepped forward. He wasn't much to look at. Jeans worn thin at the knees, a field jacket that had seen better decades, and a limp that he carried like an old, unwanted friend. He had no money, no crew, no reputation. He was a ghost himself, a penniless veteran named Ethan Cole. He looked at the devil in the pen, this beast of rage and fury. He saw the pinned ears, the flashing teeth, the hoof that struck the steel rails with the force of a sledgehammer. But Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't back away. And what he did next would change not only his life and the life of that horse, but the very soul of that small Wyoming town. It was a story that would defy everything they thought they knew about monsters, and the men who were crazy enough to believe in them. The Cheyenne auction yard was a maze of sun-bleached wood and rusting steel. It smelled of dust, sweat, and the kind of nervous energy that comes before a storm. Men with faces like old leather leaned on the rails, their coffee as black and bitter as their luck. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic drone, a familiar song of numbers and nods. Do I hear 4? Now 5. Sold. Horses came and went. Good, solid ranch horses with steady eyes, mares with foals that brought a soft murmur from the crowd. Predictable. Safe. Then the yard crew went quiet. They moved with a different kind of energy, a tension you could taste. They rolled a massive, cross-braced gate into place, sealing off the high-walled pen. The steel on the rails was scraped raw, gleaming where something huge had tried to tear its way out. 2 of the yard hands took their positions, their faces pale. They looked like men about to handle live explosives. Lot 14. He didn't walk into the pen. He owned it. The ground seemed to tremble as he moved. He was a mountain of black muscle, a storm cloud given flesh and bone. His mane was a tangled mess, his tail a thick, heavy rope, and down his left flank, a scar ran long and deep. A brutal, puckered line, like someone had tried to write their name on him with a hot iron bar. He planted his feet, coiled his hindquarters, and lifted his head. His eyes weren't the soft brown of a horse. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a cold, calculating fury. He scanned the faces of the crowd, and he didn't just look at them. He challenged them. Crack. He struck the steel rail with his front hoof. The entire structure shuddered, the sound echoing across the silent yard. Men who'd spent their lives around powerful animals took a step back. They did it without thinking, a reflex born of sudden, primal fear. Someone whispered, Jesus. A yard hand, his voice shaking just a little, read from a clipboard. Shire stallion, age, uncertain, likely 6. Weight, estimated 2,600 pounds. He swallowed hard. Prior owners, 3. All unable to maintain. History of gate failure, incident resulting in significant injury to a handler. The stallion shook his massive head, as if mocking the understatement, and struck the rail again. The steel sang a high, sharp note of protest. Hell of a horse, a man near the gate said, his voice low. Hell is right. another answered. Clint Rollins, the auctioneer, stepped up to the block. He was a good man who'd seen it all, but even he looked weary. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his prematurely white hair, and settled it back on like a helmet. "All right, folks," he said, his voice gravelly over the mic. "Lot 14. I'm not gonna lie to you. He's the biggest animal we've seen in this yard in a decade. And he's the hardest, too." No one argued. The word hard felt too small for the creature in the pen. "You buy him. You buy all of him," Clint continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "He's got bone, he's got power, and he's got a mind of his own. We've seen 3 good men try and fail. If you step up today, step up knowing what you're stepping into." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "Let's start the bidding at $1,000. Nothing. The only sound was the wind, whistling a lonely tune through the corrugated roofing. Faces that had been watching with morbid curiosity suddenly found great interest in the toes of their boots. "800, Clint tried, a forced cheerfulness in his voice. 800 for a stud that could build a dynasty." The silence was even louder this time. It felt like a judgment. 600 then. "Come on, gentlemen, I'll take 6. It was becoming painful to watch. $1,000 was a risk. 600 was an insult. The price kept falling, and with every drop, the horse seemed to grow larger, more menacing. He shifted his weight, the muscles in his haunches rippling, and knocked the rail again. A reminder that the cost wasn't just in dollars. 400, Clint said, his voice flat. Behind him, a clerk quietly set down his pencil. He reached for a different folder. This one was thin, with a single grim word stamped on the tab: kill. The deal was already done. The kill buyer had a standing offer for animals like this. A price per pound. The stallion's ear flicked at the sound of the paper, precise as a radar dish. "Anybody," Clint said, his voice tired. 200, 150. Somebody give this horse a chance. It was over. The gavel was about to fall on a death sentence. And that's when the man with the limp took one step forward. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a cowboy. He was Ethan Cole, a man the town knew mostly by the way he avoided looking anyone in the eye. Dust was ground into the fabric of his jeans like a second skin. His eyes were quiet, steady, but they held a familiar flicker. The look of a man who'd learned to watch for danger in every shadow. He raised a hand, not in a confident bid, but tentatively, like a kid asking a question in class. 150, he said. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the silence like a knife. Every head in the auction yard snapped toward him. Who was this guy? What did he think he was doing? The stallion's head came up, his ears locked onto the sudden shift in the crowd's energy. Clint squinted, trying to place him. "Sir," he said, his voice gentle through the microphone, You know what you're bidding on?" "I do," Ethan said, his gaze fixed not on the auctioneer, but on the horse. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "He's lost his mind. That horse'll kill him before the week is out. Must have a death wish." Ethan didn't seem to hear them. He was locked in a silent conversation with the animal in the pen. It wasn't the look of a man sizing up a challenge. It was something else. A strange, quiet recognition. "What's your name?" Clint asked. It wasn't procedure. It was for the story everyone knew was about to begin. "Ethan Cole." Clint nodded slowly. "Ethan, I'm not trying to scare you off. I've seen what this animal can do. He's got something broken inside him. You sure you want to take that home?" Ethan's jaw worked for a moment. He looked from the horse's furious eyes to the long, ugly scar on its flank. A scar that looked almost familiar. "I see something in his eyes," he said, his voice just a low rumble. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact, spoken by a man who knew what it was to have ghosts looking back at him from the mirror. Clint looked at the horse. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the quiet, determined veteran. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. Maybe two. He raised the gavel. Bang. The sound was sharp, final. "Sold," he announced, the word echoing with a mix of pity and relief. Lot 14 to Mr. Ethan Cole for $150. The clerk flipped the folder from kill to sale. A stamp hit the paper with a wet final thud. Ethan walked forward, his limp more pronounced on the uneven ground. He signed the papers that indemnified the yard from whatever was about to happen. As his pen scratched across the paper, the stallion slammed his body against the gate. The steel groaned, and a fresh shard of metal flaked off where his shoe had struck. "Take your time," Clint said softly off the mic. "No one's rushing you." But Ethan didn't go for a rope. He didn't grab a whip. He walked to the rail of the pen, stopped 3 feet short, and just stood there, his hands open and empty at his sides. The great horse swung its head toward him, nostrils flared, and blew out a gust of air so hot and forceful it kicked up dust from the boards. He was a storm about to break. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a small, still point in a universe of rage. The stallion's ears swiveled, tasting the air, reading the man. Long seconds stretched into a minute. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then something impossible happened. The horse, the devil, the killer that no one could touch, shifted his massive head. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't submission. He simply turned just enough to look at this strange, quiet man with both of his dark, intelligent eyes. It was nothing, a tiny movement. But in that silent, dusty auction yard, it was everything. The ride home was a symphony of chaos. The horse, now officially Ethan's problem, threw himself against the walls of the borrowed trailer with a violence that made the whole truck shudder. The driver, a man named Sam who had seen his share of bad deals, kept his eyes glued to the road. "Sign here," he said when they reached Ethan's ramshackle gate, holding out a clipboard. "Alive on delivery. After that, he's all yours." Behind them, a deafening bang echoed as the stallion kicked the divider. "You got help to unload this thing?" Sam asked, his eyes scanning Ethan's small, patched-together property. A low shed with a wind-torn roof. Fences that looked more like suggestions than barriers. "I'll manage," Ethan said. Sam shook his head. "Man at the yard told me this one's hell on gates. Watch your knees, son. They don't grow back." He didn't wait for an answer, just took the signed paper and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and pity in his wake. Ethan had spent 2 days building a new pen at the far end of his land. He'd sunk the posts deeper than usual, used thicker rails, and cross-braced every corner. It was the best he could build with scavenged materials and a dwindling bank account. He backed the trailer up to the gate and waited. He didn't drop the ramp right away. He just stood there, letting the horse hear the sounds of its new prison, the wind in the tall grass, the silence. When he finally unlatched the back, the stallion exploded out. He shot off the ramp, stumbled for a half second as his hooves hit soft dirt, and then regained his balance with the terrifying grace of a predator. He galloped to the farthest corner of the pen, spun around, and faced Ethan. His posture was unmistakable. It was a challenge, a declaration of war. "Water's there," Ethan said, his voice calm, motioning with his chin. "Feed's in the trough." The horse ignored him. He began a systematic, intelligent assault on the enclosure. He pushed his massive chest against a panel until the bolts groaned and the wood splintered. He tested every rail, every post, searching for a weakness. He wasn't just a wild animal in a panic. He was a prisoner testing the bars of his cell. He didn't drink. He didn't eat. He just paced, carving a deep circle into the dust, a soldier digging his own foxhole. That night, the wind howled. Ethan slept with one ear open, the way he'd learned to sleep long ago in a place where silence was more dangerous than noise. He woke several times to the sharp, ringing crack of a hoof striking steel. It was a relentless, percussive sound. A countdown. Around 2 a.m., a new sound joined the chorus, a sharp splintering, followed by a metallic groan. Ethan was out of bed in seconds, boots half on, flashlight cutting through the dark. He found a corner post leaning at a drunken angle. 2 rails had been kicked clean through. The stallion stood in the middle of the pen, perfectly still, not even breathing hard. He wasn't frantic. He was patient. He was a demolition expert, cataloging weaknesses for a future attack. The first week was a blur of repairs. Ethan would fix a rail in the morning, And by evening, the stallion would have found a new vulnerability. He was relentless, a force of nature focused on a single goal: escape. Twice he succeeded. The first time, he somehow worked a latch loose with his teeth, a feat of dexterity that seemed impossible for an animal his size. The second time, he simply cleared a 5-foot rail from a standstill, a breathtaking display of raw power. Both times, Ethan found himself tracking the massive hoof prints across his own property, his heart pounding. One wrong turn, one jump over a neighbor's fence, and this story would end with a bullet. Both times, the horse let him approach. He didn't charge. He snorted with contempt. But he allowed Ethan to guide him back, his presence a form of pressure the horse seemed to understand, even as he defied it. By the end of that first week, Ethan leaned his forehead against a new post he just set, the wood cool against his skin. The word mistake hung in the air, unspoken but heavy as a stone. He moved the pen. He took it apart, piece by piece, and rebuilt it in the most isolated corner of his property, down behind a small hill where the world couldn't see them. He used thicker posts, sinking them until he hit solid clay. He reinforced the gate with a heavy chain and a carabiner clip. This wasn't a pen anymore. It was a fortress. He slid feed and water through a small gap at the bottom of the rails, never opening the gate, never giving the horse an opportunity. Not forever, he told the stallion through the steel bars, just until we figure each other out. The horse flattened its ears and grabbed a mouthful of hay, not to eat, but to fling it back in Ethan's face. Then, as if remembering it was hungry, it turned and began to eat with a sullen, angry deliberation. On the fourth morning in the new pen, a dusty pickup truck rattled up the lane. A woman got out, moving with the easy confidence of someone used to dealing with unpredictable creatures. She was Maggie Torres, the local vet. "You're Ethan," she said, offering a hand. "Clint called me. Said you bought yourself a problem." "Looks that way," Ethan said. Maggie didn't try to get close. She watched the stallion from the fence line, her eyes sharp and analytical. "Body's in good shape," she said quietly. "Too good considering his history. He's either tougher than rocks or he's learned not to show pain." The stallion saw her watching and deliberately turned, showing her his shoulder, the equine equivalent of a middle finger. "Can you get a look at him?" Ethan asked. "Not without a fight we don't need," she said. "And I won't dart him just for a checkup. His eyes are telling me plenty." "What are they telling you?" Maggie's gaze was unflinching. "That people have been the problem, and so far you're just another person." She watched him for another long moment. "He's sound, physically, as sound as a bell. The damage isn't in his body, Ethan. It's in his head, and you can't x-ray a memory." "So what do I do?" "Time," she said simply. "Consistency. Don't go in there trying to prove a point. Just be there. Feed him, water him, let him see you, and let him decide that seeing you isn't a threat. It might take a week, it might take a year, or it might never happen." Her words were a cold dose of reality, but they were followed by a visitor who brought something far worse. Hank Morrison, the man who'd owned the stallion for 21 miserable days the previous winter. He pulled up in a cloud of dust and swagger, a hard man made harder by failure. He leaned on the fence, squinting at the horse. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "Thought you were smarter than this, Cole." "You had him," Ethan stated. "Had him?" Hank let out a harsh laugh. "Nobody has that thing. It passes through your life like a tornado, and you just count what's left standing afterward. Let me give you some free advice." He jerked his chin toward the horse. "He will kill you. He will do it without a second thought. Ask me how I know." "How do you know?" "3 cracked ribs," Hank snarled, tapping his own chest, "and a ranch hand who quit on the spot. But that ain't the half of it. It's that scar. You see that scar on his flank?" Ethan nodded. He'd wondered about it. "I gave him that," Hank said, a cruel glint in his eye. "Tried to teach him a lesson with a branding iron when he wouldn't load. He just took it. Didn't even flinch. Just turned and looked at me. That's when I knew. There's nothing in there but hate." Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He looked at the horse, at the brutal mark left by a man's rage. "Sell him," Hank said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or better yet, put him on the truck yourself. There's no shame in admitting you're beat. There's only shame in getting yourself killed over a worthless, broken animal. He drove away, leaving his poison hanging in the air. That evening, Ethan sat on his porch, the sun bleeding out behind the hills. He could hear the stallion, even from a distance, the steady rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a hoof against a post. Testing, always testing. $150, 2 broken pens, 3 warnings. The numbers didn't add up. But then he remembered that moment at the auction. The moment the horse had stopped its rampage and looked at him. Not with hate, not with fear, but with a flicker of something else. A question. It was a crazy thing to build a hope on. But for a man like Ethan, hope had always been a currency of last resort. He thought of Hank Morrison's smug confession. I gave him that scar. He thought of the horse's intelligent, systematic destruction. This wasn't a mindless beast. This was an animal that had been taught to fear, taught to fight back by men who only understood the language of force. And in that quiet moment, as darkness settled over the Wyoming plains, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to fight the devil. He was going to try and understand him. He whispered it to the wind, a promise to himself. I'm not ready to quit on you. From the far end of the property, the rhythmic thumping stopped. A long, low breath drifted up on the night air, the sound of a creature listening. Morning broke, clean and sharp over the hills. Ethan filled a bucket with water, the cold metal handle a familiar weight in his hand. He walked the long path to the far pen, his boots making a quiet rhythm on the gravel. He didn't rush. He didn't sneak. He just was. The stallion stood in the back corner, a black silhouette against the pale sky. He watched Ethan approach, his body tense, a coiled spring of muscle and memory. Ethan slid the bucket through the gap at the bottom of the rails, just like always. But then he did something different. He didn't leave. He had dragged an old cottonwood stump near the fence a few days earlier. Now he sat on it. He put his elbows on his knees, turned his face to the sun, and waited. The world was quiet. The wind whispered through the grass. The horse stood 30 yards away, head up, calculating. His ears worked like radar dishes, one locked on Ethan, the other sweeping the horizon for threats. If the man pushed, he would run. If the man chased, he would fight. But what do you do when the man just sits? The horse didn't have an answer for that. Minutes stretched on. Ethan watched the shadow of the fence post creep across the dust. He let the silence do the work. He let it eat away at his own impatience, at the part of him that demanded results. Finally he spoke. The words came out quiet, not meant to command but simply to exist in the space between them. I know what it's like, he said, the words surprising even himself. To be locked inside something you can't get out of. The stallion's ears pricked forward, both of them. A small change, but a significant one. His eyes were still hard, but they were listening. I know what it's like to live with that anger for so long, Ethan continued, his voice just a low murmur, that you start to think it's all you are. He breathed out a long, slow sigh. He wasn't just talking to the horse anymore. He was talking to the ghost of the man he used to be. The man who came back from the war with a limp in his step and a fire in his soul that threatened to burn him down from the inside. He looked back at the magnificent, broken animal, and he said the words that had been forming in his mind for days. A name, not a command, but an offering, a hope. From now on, he said, his voice clear and steady, your name is Valor. The word hung in the air. It didn't echo. It didn't demand a response. It just was. Ethan had chosen it carefully. Valor wasn't just about bravery in a fight. It was about having the strength to choose a different path. It was the name of a friend he'd lost overseas, a man who had pulled him from a burning Humvee, a man who had shown him the true meaning of courage. Giving the name to this horse felt right. It felt like a debt being paid, a legacy being honored. The horse didn't react in any way a human would recognize. He didn't nicker or soften. What he did was much more subtle and much more profound. He stood his ground. He didn't retreat to the far corner. He held his head steady, his dark eyes fixed on the man, the bucket, and the new sound that now belonged to him. The bellows of his lungs moved in and out, a slow, steady rhythm that matched the quiet of the morning. After a long moment, he lowered his head just an inch. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. A flicker of acknowledgement. A knot inside Ethan's chest, a knot he hadn't even known was there, began to loosen. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just held the moment, fragile as a bird's egg. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, letting Valor see the intention before the action. He backed away step by step, picked up his empty bucket, and walked toward the house without looking back. He fought the urge, the desperate need to turn and see if the spell was broken. He waited until he reached the corner of the pen, then allowed himself one quick glance. The big horse was still there, watching him go. And for the first time, the eyes that looked back at him weren't filled with fire. They were filled with a question. That night, for the first time since he'd arrived, there was no sound of hoof against steel. There was only the sound of the wind and the quiet, steady breathing of an animal considering the possibility of peace. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one measured not in repairs but in tiny, incremental shifts of trust. Ethan never went inside the pen. He never carried a rope. He never asked for anything. 7 in the morning, 5 in the evening. He brought food and water. He sat on his cottonwood stump. He talked, not at the horse, but to the space around them. He told stories about the sky, about the way the grass grew, about the friend whose name the horse now carried. He let his voice become just another part of the landscape. On the 5th day, a breakthrough. As Ethan approached, Valor didn't turn his back. He stood his ground facing him. A small concession, but it felt like a seismic shift. On the 10th day, something bigger. Ethan set the bucket down and then, holding his breath, took 2 steps closer to the fence than he ever had before. He planted his feet and waited, his heart thudding against his ribs. Valor's nostrils flared. His ears came up. He was a statue of black marble, every muscle tensed. He took a long, slow breath, tasting the air, analyzing the change in the routine. Then one of his ears relaxed, drooping slightly to the side. It was a signal Maggie had told him to watch for. "I'm listening, but I'm not preparing to flee." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Weeks bled into a month. The angry, challenging snorts were replaced by softer, more inquisitive breaths. Valor started eating while Ethan was still there, a huge gesture of trust for a prey animal. Ethan began introducing new things, always from outside the pen. The sound of a halter clip opening and closing, the sight of a saddle blanket draped over a rail, the feel of a soft brush scraped against the wood. Each new thing was offered, then taken away, teaching the horse that novelty didn't have to equal danger. One morning the air was cool and damp with the promise of spring. The moment arrived without any warning. Ethan set the hay down, and then slowly, deliberately, he unlatched the gate. He didn't swing it wide open. He just opened it a foot, creating a space he did not step through. Then he returned to his stump and sat. Valor watched, his eyes wide. The path to freedom was right there, an open question. He could bolt. He could run and never look back. He paced back and forth in front of the opening, the conflict visible in every line of his body. The memory of traps, the instinct for freedom. He looked at the open gate. Then he looked at Ethan. And then he turned away from the opening and walked to the far side of the pen, put his head down, and began to eat. He had chosen to stay. Ethan felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked him off the stump. He waited an hour before he quietly closed and latched the gate. The next day he did it again, and the next. The open gate became part of the routine, a symbol. "You are not my prisoner." The day finally came. Ethan opened the gate, and this time, he didn't retreat to his stump. He took a single, quiet step inside the pen. Valor's head shot up. The old tension returned in a flash. He was a predator again, cornered and dangerous. Ethan stopped. He didn't try to get closer. He just stood there inside the horse's world for the first time, and he made himself small. He looked at the ground. He breathed. He waited. An hour passed. Then 2. Ethan's legs began to ache. The sun beat down on his neck. Finally, just as he was about to give up for the day, Valor took a step toward him. Then another. He came slowly, hesitantly, his head low. He stopped just out of arm's reach and blew a long, warm breath that washed over Ethan's shirt. He was smelling him, reading his story in the scent of sweat and dust and coffee. "Hey there," Ethan whispered. He slowly raised a hand, palm open, and held it out. Valor watched the hand for a long time. He could have crushed it. He could have taken the arm off at the elbow. He leaned forward, the whiskers on his muzzle brushing against Ethan's skin, a delicate, electric touch. Then he pressed his forehead gently against Ethan's chest and let out a sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. It was a sound of surrender, not of defeat, but of release, the giving up of a burden he had carried for too long. Ethan felt the massive weight lean against him, and he wrapped his arms around the horse's powerful neck, burying his face in the coarse, tangled mane. He felt the steady, slow beat of a heart that had finally found a safe harbor. "Holy hell!" The voice came from the lane. Ethan looked up. It was Sam, the driver, his truck idling, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been coming by every week or so, officially to check on his trailer, but really to see if Ethan was still alive. "I have never," Sam said, his voice hushed with awe, "seen him let a man do that. I wouldn't have bet a nickel on it." "Don't," Ethan said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I might need to borrow it." When Maggie came out later that week, she didn't even need to get out of her truck. She just watched from the driver's seat, a wide, knowing smile on her face. "See that?" she said, pointing. "The soft eye, the loose lip. He's not bracing for a fight anymore. He's carrying himself like he chose to be here." "He did," Ethan said. "Looks like he's mapping you into his world, Ethan," she said. "Not in the threat column, not in the doesn't matter column, in the familiar column. That's the only place trust can grow." She looked at him, her expression turning serious. "But don't get complacent. The biggest mistakes happen right when you think the story's over." She was right. The story wasn't over. The real test, the one that would forge their bond in fire and terror, was still to come. And it was rolling in on a dark, bruised-looking cloud from the west. The storm didn't arrive. It attacked. The sky, which had been a sullen gray all afternoon, turned a sickly, violent purple. The wind began to shriek, a high, thin sound that clawed at the corners of the house. Lightning spiderwebbed across the horizon, silent at first, then followed by a deep, guttural thunder that rattled the windows in their frames. This wasn't a summer shower. This was one of those Wyoming furies, the kind that rips trees out by the roots and reminds you just how small you are. Ethan was in the kitchen, watching the storm roll in, when a sudden, sickening feeling washed over him. Valor? He grabbed his coat and flashlight and plunged into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Rain, flung sideways, stung his face like handfuls of gravel. He could barely see, but he could hear it, the sound of panic. Out at the far pen, Valor was a phantom of black terror. He was running the fence line, his head high, his tail flagged. The whites of his eyes gleamed in the strobing flashes of lightning. The calm they had built over months was being shredded by the storm's primal chaos. "Easy, boy, easy," Ethan shouted, but the wind snatched the words and flung them away. It happened in an instant. A savage gust of wind, a localized vortex of fury, slammed into the old lean-to shelter next to the pen. There was a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of paper, a scream of nails pulling free from old wood. The roof was ripped away and sent cartwheeling into the darkness. The walls buckled. A massive support beam, a piece of timber as thick as a telephone pole, snapped at its base and came crashing down. It didn't fall into the pen. It fell right across the gate, and it took out a 10-foot section of the fence with it. Valor was free. The horse saw the opening, a gaping hole leading to the wild, open prairie. His instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed at him to run, to flee the terrifying noise and the collapsing structures. Ethan was halfway to the pen when a second beam, loosened by the first collapse, tore free. He saw it coming in the split-second glare of a lightning strike, a dark shape swinging down like the fist of God. He tried to dive, but his bad leg buckled. The beam caught him just above the knee. The impact was sickening, a wet crunch of bone and muscle. He went down hard into the mud, a raw scream of agony torn from his throat. The heavy timber pinned both of his legs, trapping him. White-hot pain exploded behind his eyes. He was helpless. Through the sheeting rain and the fog of pain, he saw Valor. The big stallion had bolted through the opening, just as any horse would. He was a black shape disappearing into the storm. Ethan's heart sank. He was alone, injured. He tried to push the beam, his hands slipping in the slick, cold mud. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. But then, the black shape at the edge of his vision stopped. It hesitated, a silhouette against the violent sky. It turned, and it began to come back. Valor wasn't running from the storm anymore. He was running into it. He galloped back toward the wrecked pen, his hooves churning the mud into a thick spray. He came in low and fast, his breath blasting from his nostrils like steam. He didn't stop at the fence line. He came right up to Ethan, planting his feet wide in the mud, positioning his body as a shield against the driving wind. For a heartbeat, he just stood there, his great head lowered, his dark eyes assessing the situation with that same unnerving intelligence Ethan had seen on the first day. Then he lowered his head further. The muscles in his neck and shoulders bunched into solid knots of power, and he drove his forehead into the center of the massive beam. Thump! The wood shuddered, but it held fast. Valor backed up a step, snorted, and hit it again. Harder. Crack! A splinter of wood flew off. He wasn't just blindly ramming it. He was focusing his immense strength, striking the same spot over and over. He hit it a third time, a full-body blow that was less a push and more a battering ram. There was a loud, splintering pop, and the beam shifted. Just an inch. But it was enough. "Again!" Ethan roared, his voice raw. "Do it again, Valor!" The horse seemed to understand. He gathered himself and delivered one final, explosive blow. The storm-soaked timber, already weakened, gave way with a loud crack and rolled sideways. Ethan scrambled, dragging his legs free. A fresh wave of searing pain shot up from his ankle. But he was out. He was free. Valor lowered his head, nudging Ethan's shoulder with his muzzle, the breath hot against Ethan's cold, wet skin. "Good boy," Ethan gasped, pulling himself up by grabbing onto Valor's tangled mane. "You saved my life." The storm was still raging. Debris was flying through the air. Ethan's legs screamed in protest with every step, but he knew they had to get to better cover. He stumbled toward the main barn, leaning heavily against the stallion's solid frame. Valor stayed right with him, a living, breathing windbreak, his body a warm, solid presence in the chaos. They huddled together in the narrow lee of the barn, the corrugated metal roof thrumming like a drum under the torrential rain. Ethan pressed his side against Valor's, feeling the steady thud of the horse's heart, the tremor of adrenaline that still coursed through them both. The Devil of Cheyenne, the killer horse. He hadn't run. He had come back. He had faced the storm, faced the terror, and saved the one human who had shown him that not all hands were meant to strike. In the heart of the storm, pinned between the wind and the rain, a final bond was forged. Not in quiet patience, but in shared terror, in a stunning act of courage. The man had saved the horse from a death sentence, and now the horse had returned the favor. Dawn broke over a landscape of devastation. The yard was a junkyard of splintered wood and twisted metal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised, quiet world. Ethan was on his knees trying to rig a temporary gate, his ankle a swollen, throbbing mess, when he heard the crunch of tires. 2 trucks. Clint Rollins, the auctioneer, got out of the first one. Hank Morrison climbed out of the second. They weren't there for a social call. They looked like undertakers who had come to view the body. "Heard you had some weather," Clint said, his eyes taking in the wreckage. Hank didn't even look at Ethan. His gaze was fixed on the barn. "Figured we'd find him gone and you laid up. Or worse. He had a rifle in the rack of his truck. He wasn't hiding it." "He's right here," Ethan said, his voice quiet. He whistled, a low, soft sound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the massive black head of the stallion appeared from around the corner of the barn. He wasn't wild-eyed. He wasn't frantic. He walked out into the yard, his steps calm and deliberate, and came to stand beside Ethan. He nudged Ethan's shoulder with his nose, a soft, inquisitive touch. Hank Morrison's jaw went slack. Son of a... He couldn't finish the sentence. He just stared, his smug certainty crumbling into dust. That horse never let anyone get that close. Ethan ignored him. He ran a hand down Valor's powerful neck. The horse leaned into the touch. Just then, Maggie's vet truck pulled in. She took in the scene in a single glance. The destroyed pen, the calm horse standing untethered next to the injured man, and the two dumbfounded ranchers. She walked a slow circle around Valor, her clinical gaze missing nothing. Eyes are soft, she murmured almost to herself. No flare in the nostrils. He's not on guard. Clint, Hank, you're not looking at the same horse you sold. Clint folded his arms, his expression a mixture of awe and confusion. What in God's name happened here, Ethan? Ethan looked from the shattered beam to the horse who had broken it. The storm happened, he said. He had every chance to run. The fence was gone. He could be halfway to Nebraska by now. He paused, meeting Clint's eyes. But he didn't run. He came back for me. The story spread through Cheyenne like a wildfire. It started with Clint and Hank, who told it over coffee at the diner, their voices hushed with a reverence that replaced their earlier scorn. From there, it leaped from phone call to phone call, from feed store to post office. The details got bigger with each telling. The beam became a whole tree. The wind became a full-blown tornado. Valor was no longer the devil of Cheyenne. He was the hero horse, the monster who had become a savior. People started driving by Ethan's property, slowing down to catch a glimpse of the legend. Cars he didn't recognize would park at the end of his lane. The killer horse that saved his owner. The phrase was on everyone's lips. But a new, unexpected threat emerged from this newfound fame. A man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was everything Ethan wasn't. Wealthy, arrogant, a breeder of expensive show horses from Jackson Hole. He saw not a hero, but a commodity, a story he could sell. He arrived in a gleaming silver truck that was worth more than Ethan's entire property. He wore a crisp white hat and boots made of some exotic animal. He didn't come to see Valor. He came to buy him. I heard the story, Thorne said, waving a dismissive hand at the wreckage. Incredible. A real-life fairy tale. The beast becomes the prince. It's a gold mine. He's not for sale, Ethan said flatly. Thorne chuckled, a condescending sound. Everything is for sale, Mr. Cole. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000. Cash. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. $50,000. It was more money than he'd seen in his entire life. It could fix his roof, buy a new truck, pay off his debts. It could give him a life without the constant, grinding worry of poverty. Think about it, Thorne said, seeing the flicker of conflict in Ethan's eyes. You can buy a dozen good, safe horses for that kind of money. Why keep the one that almost got you killed? He was twisting the story, turning Valor's act of loyalty into a liability. He didn't almost get me killed, Ethan said, his voice cold. He got me saved. A fluke, Thorne scoffed. A one-time event. Next time a storm hits, he might react differently. He might run you down. He's a dangerous, unpredictable animal with a history. You got lucky once. Are you willing to bet your life it'll happen again? Thorne left his business card, a crisp, embossed piece of cardboard. The offer stands for 48 hours. Don't be a fool. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The number haunted him. $50,000. It was a fortune. It was a way out. He looked around his small, crumbling house. He thought about his bad leg, about the bills piling up. Was he being selfish? Was it fair to deny himself a future for the sake of one animal, no matter how special? The next morning, he walked out to the pen. Valor came to him, resting his head over the top rail. He looked into those dark, intelligent eyes. He saw the trust there, the quiet understanding that had been bought with patience and paid for in a storm. Could he put a price on that? Could he sell the only living being that had ever looked at him and seen not a broken soldier, but someone worth coming back for? He thought about Thorne's words. A dangerous, unpredictable animal. Was he right? Was the monster still lurking underneath the surface, waiting for the right trigger? The doubt, planted like a poisonous seed, began to sprout. He found himself looking at Valor differently, watching for a flicker of the old rage, a pin of the ears, a hardening of the eye. He was letting Thorne's fear get into his head. The 48 hours were almost up. Ethan was standing on his porch, Thorne's card in his hand, his mind a battlefield of doubt and loyalty. He saw Thorne's silver truck turn down his lane. He was coming for his answer. Just then, a small, beat-up sedan pulled in behind the truck. It was a young woman from town, Sarah, with her 7-year-old son, Leo. Leo had been having nightmares since his father, a soldier like Ethan, had been deployed overseas. Sarah had heard the story of valor and had come on a desperate, long-shot hope. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice trembling. "But Leo, he loves horses and he heard about yours. He thinks your horse is the bravest in the world." Leo was hiding behind his mother's legs, his eyes wide as he stared at the giant horse in the pen. Before Ethan could answer, Thorne stepped out of his truck. "This is a private discussion," he snapped at Sarah. But Leo wasn't listening. He broke away from his mom and, with the fearless innocence of a child, ran right up to the fence. "Whoa, kid! Get back!" Thorne yelled, taking a step forward. It was the wrong move. Thorne's sudden, aggressive energy was exactly the kind of thing that had once set Valor off. The horse's head shot up, his ears went back. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. The monster was back. Thorne froze, his face pale. But Leo didn't flinch. He just stood at the fence, his small hand outstretched. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're not a monster. You're a hero." And then the most incredible thing happened. Valor, who had tensed to charge, seemed to hear the boy. The tension drained from his body. The ears came forward. He took a slow step toward the fence, lowered his massive head and gently, so gently, nudged the boy's tiny hand with his soft muzzle. Ethan watched, his heart in his throat. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a one-time thing. Valor wasn't just responding to him anymore. He could sense innocence. He could recognize a lack of threat. He had learned a new language, the language of gentleness. Ethan turned to Thorne, the business card still in his hand. He looked the wealthy man dead in the eye, and he ripped the card in half. "There's your answer," he said. Thorne stared speechless at the man, the boy, and the horse. He had seen everything he needed to see. This wasn't just an animal. It was a bond he could never buy, a loyalty he would never understand. He got back in his silver truck and drove away, defeated not by an argument, but by a quiet moment of trust. From that day on, the story of Valor changed again. He wasn't just the horse that saved his owner. He was the horse that healed him. And their journey was just beginning. The ripped business card was a declaration. Ethan had chosen loyalty over fortune, a quiet life with his horse over an easy one without him. That single act, witnessed by Sarah and her son, cemented the new legend of Valor. He wasn't just a local hero anymore. He was becoming a symbol. The invitation started as a trickle, then became a flood. The first came from the county fair. They wanted Valor to be the centerpiece of a Second Chances showcase. Ethan was hesitant. A crowd, the noise, the chaos. It could undo everything. "We'll set the rules," he told Maggie. "And if he gets stressed, we leave. No questions asked." They arrived before the fair officially opened, letting Valor absorb the strange smells of cotton candy and diesel fuel, the sounds of distant music and barking dogs. Ethan led him to a quiet, shaded pen, and they just stood together, watching the world wake up. Before long, a crowd gathered. Not a mob, but a quiet, respectful line of people. They came to see the horse from the story. A little boy, no older than Leo, reached out a tentative hand. "Can I?" "Ask him, not me," Ethan said softly. "Let him see your hand. Move slow." The boy did, and Valor, the beast who once shattered steel gates, lowered his head and allowed the small fingers to stroke his cheek. A collective sigh went through the crowd. Over the next hour, a procession of people, kids, teenagers, old ranchers with tears in their eyes, came to meet Valor. He stood like a gentle king, patient and calm, accepting their touch as if it were his due. "Show us something," a man called out. Ethan didn't ask for a trick, He simply opened his hand, a gesture Valor now knew. The horse took a step forward. Ethan turned his shoulder, and Valor mirrored the movement. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. "He's not a trick horse," Ethan told the crowd, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "He's a partner. We just learned to speak the same language." After the fair, things escalated. A horse rescue in Laramie asked Ethan to host a workshop. He stood in the middle of a round pen, with Valor loose beside him, and spoke to a dozen handlers who were struggling with their own problem horses. "You don't start by demanding trust," he explained, as Valor nudged his back playfully. "You start by proving you're trustworthy. You give them a choice. You give them an escape. And when they realize you're not a trap, they'll choose to stay." He showed them how to read the flick of an ear, the tightening of a lip. He taught them the language of patience. A woman who hadn't been able to get within 10 feet of her rescued Mustang ended the day with the horse eating from her hand, tears streaming down her face. Next came the schools. A principal invited them to an elementary school playground. The kids sat in a circle on the blacktop, their faces a mixture of awe and excitement. "Does he get scared?" a little girl asked. "All the time," Ethan answered honestly. "He just learned what to do with it. He learned that being scared doesn't mean you have to be mean." He tapped his own chest. "Same as people." The story of Valor became a parable, a living lesson about redemption, about how the deepest wounds can be healed with kindness, about how the things society throws away might just be the thing that saves you. Clint Rollins made his apology publicly at a town fundraiser. He stood at a microphone, holding the same gavel he'd used to sell Lot 14. "I told you all that day that he was the hardest horse we'd ever seen," Clint said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I was right. But I also said that in the right hands, he could be something special. I didn't believe it then. I was just trying to make a sale." He looked across the room and found Ethan. "I believe it now. Ethan, you weren't just the right hands. You were the only hands." The town that had once pitied and feared him now celebrated him. He was their story. Their proof that miracles could happen, not with magic, but with hard work and a stubborn refusal to give up. But for Ethan, the real miracle wasn't the fame or the accolades. It was the quiet moments, the rides they took in the evenings, when the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. They would ride without a destination, the gentle creak of the saddle and the soft thud of Valor's hooves, the only sounds. On one of those rides, as they crested a small hill overlooking the valley, the full weight of what they had accomplished settled over Ethan. He stopped Valor and just looked out at the world. He thought of the man he was at the auction, broke, limping, hiding from the world. He thought of the horse in the pen, a caged storm of rage and terror. Two broken souls discarded by everyone else. He ran his hand along Valor's powerful neck, feeling the warmth and the steady pulse of life beneath the skin. "Not everyone gets a second chance," he said, his voice a low whisper. "But you and me, we got each other. That's better." Valor shook his great mane, a sound like gentle thunder, and blew out a long, soft breath. It was the sound of agreement, the sound of peace. They unsaddled back at the barn as the last of the light faded from the sky. Ethan loosened the cinch, and Valor stood perfectly still, not like a trained horse, but like a friend waiting patiently. Ethan turned him loose in the pasture, and the horse didn't bolt. He took 2 steps, lowered his head, and began to graze, completely at ease. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching the big black shape move contentedly in the twilight. The town had its story, its symbol, but he had the real thing. He had the quiet moments, the shared breath, the unspoken understanding that passed between two beings who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. Not unscathed, but whole. He went inside, leaving the door ajar so he could hear the sounds of the night. He was not the same man who had lived in that house a year ago. The limp was still there, but it didn't define him anymore. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter now. He had found a purpose not in fighting, but in healing. He woke once in the middle of the night to the sound of Valor nickering softly in the dark. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. There would be more storms. There would be more challenges. Life was not a fairy tale, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Outside, under a blanket of Wyoming stars, the horse that was once a devil, then a hero, then a legend, was finally just a horse, safe in his field, watching over the house of the man who was his friend. If this story about a bond that healed two broken souls moved you, let us know your favorite part in the comments below. What do you think was the real turning point for Valor? And if you want more stories that prove hope can be found in the most unexpected places, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new journey. Your support helps us keep finding and sharing these incredible tales. Thanks for watching.